1991, a year of momentous happenings that saw the promise of an end to apartheid and the Cold War, also saw the death of a jazz legend. In the simmering Gulf conflict, Iraq was given a final withdrawal deadline of January the 15th to withdraw from Kuwait. Ignoring the warnings, Saddam Hussein held his ground, and a day later, Operation Desert Storm began. The Allies' devastating and sustained aerial bombardment involved cruise missiles launched from US warships. According to Saddam Hussein, the mother of all battles had begun, and he urged the Iraqi people to stand up to evil. After more than a month of intensive air attacks, the Allies launched a land offensive on the 24th of February. One day later, the Iraqis began retreating, and on the 27th of February, President George Bush declared victory. Kuwait was liberated, but Saddam Hussein remained in power in Baghdad. A few months before his death, musician Miles Davis, one of the most significant figures in post-war jazz, was awarded the Légion d'honneur, France's national order, in a special ceremony in Paris. Cultural Affairs Minister Jack Lang pinned the order's red ribbon on the 66-year-old trumpeter and bandleader. Widely considered one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century, Davis was at the forefront of almost every major development in jazz from World War II to the 1990s. Davis helped pioneer the post-war jazz movement known as bebop. Known for his lyrical soloing, he subsequently had an illustrious career playing with such influential musicians as Charles Mingus, Thelonious Monk and John Coltrane. Miles Davis died on September the 28th, 1991. The Soviet Union announced that it had agreed with its Warsaw Pact partners to dismantle the alliance's military structure by April the 1st. 3 Pact members, Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Poland, had been pressing Moscow for a summit to set a formal date for winding up the Soviet-led alliance. Moscow felt the move would reduce the threat of confrontation in Europe and was in line with the spirit of the 1990 Paris Agreement, at which 34 countries officially ended the Cold War between capitalist West and communist East that had existed since World War II. The Warsaw Pact had been set up in 1955 and originally comprised Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland and Romania, as well as the Soviet Union, but Albania soon left. It had been virtually defunct as a military organization since the collapse of communist rule in 4 of the group and the reunification of Germany. And it wasn't long before the United States began the process of making sweeping reductions in its nuclear forces worldwide, and the Soviet Union welcomed the cuts. The 1991 Soviet coup d'etat attempt, also known as the August Putsch or August Coup, was a 3-day period during which a group of members of the Soviet Union's government briefly deposed Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and attempted to take control of the country. The coup leaders were hardline members of the Communist Party who felt that Gorbachev's reform program had gone too far, and that a new union treaty that he had negotiated dispersed too much of the central government's power to the republics. Although the coup collapsed in only 3 days and Gorbachev returned to power, the event undermined the legitimacy of the Communist Party and contributed towards the collapse of the Soviet Union. While their northern neighbours were making efforts at peace, the ethnic conflict in the Baltic states became a war that cost the lives of thousands. Yugoslav Prime Minister Ante Markovic called for Serbs and Croats to surrender their weapons or have the army take them away by force, following the latest round of ethnic violence between the two groups. Meanwhile, the Croatian Vice President of Yugoslavia, Stipe Mesic, said Croatia would crush a rebellion by the minority Serbs if the Yugoslav army did not restore peace there within 1 month. Later in the year, Nelson Mandela, President of the African National Congress, while he was in New York to address the United Nations General Assembly, said that a breakthrough might be near in the struggle to dismantle apartheid. He thanked the representatives who greeted him at the UN Plaza Hotel for their aid in fighting apartheid. 1991, a year of disarmament, war, and hope for black Africans, was beyond doubt a year of momentous happenings. In a year of momentous happenings, 1992 was a time for apologies, new friendships, and fears of a new arms trade. When United States President George Bush and Russian President Boris Yeltsin held their first talks since the demise of the Soviet Union, not only had their countries embarked on a new course of friendship and partnership, but fears of a new arms trade were growing. There was a threat that, with the end of the Cold War, the republics and their efficient armaments industry could become major arms dealers in the fragile political world of 1992. Many problems were facing the defense industry of the former Soviet Union as it tried to convert its military production to a more peaceful industry. In the Moscow region alone, 70% of the economy was reliant on the production of arms. With whole cities depending on it, military production didn't just dominate Russian industry in many areas, it was the only industry employing millions of people. The manufacturers of the MiG-29 fighter aircraft, in an effort to diversify production, came up with the MAI microlight aircraft, while this rocket factory was turning its high-tech expertise over to simple bicycle manufacturing. Though some Russian experts weren't so positive about the efforts to change.
Most of the dedicated military industries, they simply cannot convert it. You have to change the entire production lines. You have to retrain the labor force. And as far as existing enterprises are concerned, for instance, missile production enterprises, at best you can use the walls, the roofs, some elements of the infrastructure, which means you have totally to rebuild the enterprise. And maybe it's cheaper even to build a new enterprise than to waste the money removing the old equipment and bringing the new equipment.
In April, following a tense period of escalating tensions and sporadic military incidents, open warfare began in Sarajevo. Heavily armed Serb forces launched saturation bombing attacks on a number of fronts and laid siege to many cities, including Sarajevo. Driven by the prospect of a great Serbia, unified by their Orthodox Christian faith, and memories of Muslim domination under the Ottoman Empire, Serbs had captured 70% of Bosnia. In Geneva, the United Nations Human Rights Commission demanded immediate, unrestricted access for the Red Cross to all places of detention and the release of everyone arbitrarily arrested or detained. The UN condemned forced population transfers, or so-called ethnic cleansing, as an abhorrent breach of international human rights standards. The Red Cross, which had visited 11 detention camps in Bosnia-Herzegovina, 4 of them run by Serbs, had consistently said all sides in the fighting were guilty of atrocities. United Nations peacekeeping advance teams headed for trouble spots in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia as talks on the future of Bosnia began in the capital, Sarajevo. Early morning convoys fanned out from Belgrade, taking military and police officers to staging posts in Croatia for scouting the terrain where a 14,000-strong UN contingent would take up positions between the warring factions. 3 UN-protected zones were set up in eastern and western Slavonia, in eastern Croatia, and Krajina in the south of the Republic. Meanwhile, the 49th anniversary of the founding of the former Yugoslav state, which was made up of 6 republics, occurred in November, even though Yugoslavia was a country that had been reduced to just 2 of the original 6 regions. Because Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia and Macedonia had declared independence, Yugoslavia now consisted of Serbia and Montenegro. But the Federal Assembly failed to nullify the decree declaring the holiday, so it was still observed by Serbs and Montenegrins. Until 1991, when civil war broke out in the region, the anniversary had been celebrated as Unification Day. In 1992, the historic town, which had been captured by Serbian forces, was a battle-scarred testament to the end of Yugoslavia, a nation to which it gave birth in 1943. In a year that had also seen an apology come from the Vatican when Pope John Paul II lifted the historic edict of the Inquisition against Galileo Galilei, 1992 was a year of momentous happenings. In a year of momentous happenings, 1993 was a year that saw terrorism strike the Big Apple and a new era for European unity. Despite its strong international ties, New York had largely avoided the terrorism that had become common elsewhere. When a car bomb was detonated below Tower 1 of the World Trade Center in New York City in February 1993, that was to change forever. The 680-kilogram bomb was intended to knock down Tower 1, the North Tower, causing it to fall into Tower 2, the South Tower, bringing both towers down and killing thousands of people. It failed to do so, but did kill 6 people and injured over 1,000 occupants. In Bosnia, Serb shelling of women and children in the eastern Muslim town of Srebrenica had infuriated international aid officials, who urged greater United Nations involvement to prevent further slaughter. The powerlessness of UN workers to prevent catastrophe in Srebrenica was brought home when Bosnian Serbs unleashed a ferocious artillery barrage minutes after their commander swore in Sarajevo to respect a ceasefire. Shells exploded over a school packed with refugees and a football field where children played, raining down a shower of hot shrapnel that severed limbs amid nightmare scenes of panic, according to UN workers. 56 civilians, including 15 children, died immediately, and 90 people were wounded. It was the largest number of people to be killed in Srebrenica in a single day. Weeks of relentless Serb attacks on Srebrenica had killed hundreds of people, mainly civilians. As the pounding of Srebrenica continued, world pressure increased on the Bosnian Serbs to accept peace. Srebrenica, packed with tens of thousands of refugees, was one of only 3 areas held by the Muslim-led Bosnian government in eastern Bosnia. In the UK, the Brea, carrying 84,500 tons of crude oil, ran aground in a storm off the north coast of Scotland after suffering engine failure. The captain and 33 crew members were lifted off by helicopters after anchors failed to stop the ship drifting towards the shore near Sumburgh Head at the extreme south of the Shetland Islands. The tanker finally broke up, shedding its oil cargo after a week of ferocious weather. In Russia, President Boris Yeltsin stepped up pressure on deputies holding out in the parliament building, adding armoured personnel carriers to his blockading force. The APCs moved in just after dawn to join police and Interior Ministry troopers behind the razor-wire barricades around the so-called White House. Boris Yeltsin and his rivals in the blockaded White House, Vice President Alexander Rutskoy and Parliament Chairman Ruslan Kazbulatov, had ruled out any compromise. Police and demonstrators exchanged blows near the Parliament when the authorities tried to clear protesters gathering outside the wire perimeter. The demonstration by pro-Parliament supporters outside a nearby underground railway station was broken up by police using shields and batons. In the Dutch town of Maastricht, the clock in the town square tolled at midnight on the 31st of October, heralding a new era for Europe. The European Union was here at last, and in Maastricht they partied through the night, celebrating the fact that the talking was finally over. The Treaty of Maastricht had given the town certain notoriety, but the locals were sceptical about the process.
I think it has to do with the people of government, the people who make the rules, the people who rule the people. That has nothing to do with the ordinary man in the street.
Maastricht is where Holland, Germany and Belgium all meet. It is one of Europe's crossroads. Even before the new union, you could use any currency in shops and cafes. The Maastricht Treaty is officially known as the Treaty of the European Union, and with it, the EU came into existence for the first time. Some feared the long-term arguing had set back the chances of that model succeeding elsewhere.
I'm a federalist or a unionist, and I believe in a united Europe. And that's why I think that's been very bad. The last 2 years have harmed the cause that I believe in.
1993, a year that had seen the death of 2 entertainment mavericks, when avant-garde rock star Frank Zappa died of prostate cancer, and a solemn state funeral mass was held in Rome for Italian film director Federico Fellini. Unquestionably, a year of momentous happenings. 1994, a year that saw a tentative ceasefire in Northern Ireland and the end of apartheid in South Africa, was yet another year of momentous happenings. In May, outgoing South African President F.W. de Klerk conceded victory to Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress after the country's first all-race elections. Mandela led the dancing right across South Africa. In city streets and township settlements, ANC supporters and others celebrated the new democratic South Africa. Also in May, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was laid to rest next to the grave of her assassinated first husband, John F. Kennedy, at Arlington National Cemetery, just outside Washington, D.C. People stood outside the cemetery quietly as the funeral procession of limousines slowly made its way from National Airport up George Washington Parkway and into the Cemetery of Heroes. At the graveside were her surviving children Caroline and John Jr. In a eulogy, President Bill Clinton said that the former First Lady seemed always to do the right thing in the right way. Kennedy Onassis had been praised not only for her sophistication that brought a sense of style to the nation, but also for her bravery in the face of the numerous tragedies that befell her through her life.
At the sight of the eternal flame lit by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis 31 years ago, whether she was soothing a nation grieving for a former president or raising its children with the care and the privacy they deserve, or simply being a good friend, she seemed always to do the right thing in the right way, with admiration, love, and gratitude for the inspiration and the dreams she gave to all of us. We say goodbye to Jackie today. May the flame she lit so long ago burn ever brighter here and always brighter in our hearts.
Earlier in the year, Clinton, in Moscow for a two-day summit with President Boris Yeltsin, had visited another memorial, this time the tomb of the unknown warrior. He saluted as soldiers laid a wreath on his behalf before the monument to the World War II dead. Clinton then returned to the Kremlin to sign agreements on the dismantling of Ukraine's nuclear arsenal, on paper the world's third largest. Some 170 nuclear missiles were to be transferred to Russia for destruction. Later, holding a baby for photographers, the First Lady walked in Moscow's Red Square and greeting local well-wishers waiting for her in the winter snow. Later in this year of momentous happenings, tragedy struck in the Baltic Sea. The ferry Estonia sunk while en route from Tallinn, Estonia to Stockholm, Sweden. In seas that were described as normally bad, the ferry, which had been steaming at an estimated 14 knots, went down with the loss of 852 lives. This was to be one of the deadliest maritime disasters of the late 20th century. Only 137 lives were saved. Finnish Navy helicopter crews worked tirelessly in dangerous conditions throughout the next day, rescuing the survivors who had miraculously endured the freezing conditions. In a move towards peace in Northern Ireland, the Provisional IRA announced in August a cessation of military operations. In the following period, there were disputes about the permanence of the ceasefire, whether parties linked to paramilitaries should be included in talks, and the rate of normalisation in Northern Ireland. Loyalist bombings and shootings, and punishment beatings from both sides continued. Also making efforts towards peace were Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Jordan's King Hussein, with peace talks in Amman. The two countries had been striving to resolve the thorny issues of security, water rights to the Jordan and Yarmouk rivers, and a claim by Jordan to about 350 square kilometres of mainly arid land. And later in the year, witnessed by US President Bill Clinton, the historic peace treaty was signed, ending 46 years of war between the two countries. But in the West Bank, Palestinians were demonstrating against the peace agreement to which Yasser Arafat, the PLO leader, had not been invited. 1994, a year of momentous happenings.